It didn't happen on a film set. No lights, no cameras, no second take waiting in reserve. One moment, Bruce Lee moves with the calm precision people swear is inhuman. Every muscle answering, every step exact. The next, his body shuts down so abruptly that even those closest to him go pale and fall silent. There's no dramatic fall, just a stop, a wait that shouldn't be there. Someone whispers what no one wants to say. This is the end. Injuries like that don't come back from. Careers don't survive them. Reputations don't either. But the danger isn't only what might be broken. In the seconds that follow, a small, almost invisible detail appears, something only a few notice, and it changes the stakes completely. Because now the threat isn't just to his work or his future in public. It's to the one rule he has never violated. Never lie to his own body. Never pretend strength where there is none. And that is where the real fight begins. So let's go back, before the whisper, before the silence, to the moment when no one yet understood what was about to be tested. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. They had packed the room so tightly that shoulders brushed whenever someone shifted. Bare feet whispered across worn mats. A notebook opened and closed, paper rasping as if the sound could steady a nervous hand. The place smelled of warm rubber, dust, and sharp liniment, useful, honest, impossible to hide. Students stood beside actors, friends of friends beside men who had come only to test a story they didn't quite believe. Bruce Lee did not perform an entrance. He stepped in as if the crowd were weather. Noticed, accepted, never obeyed. "Breathe quieter," he told a young man, and his own breath answered with a thin shh through the teeth. He touched a shoulder, rotated it a few degrees. He nudged a heel, turned a foot outward, and the stance changed without drama. No flourish. Precision instead of volume. Near the back, a man leaned on a pillar with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't insult. He watched Bruce the way a gambler watches hands, waiting for a slip. When the warm-up ended, his tone dropped like a coin on a table. "Show it full speed." A ripple moved through the room, small, eager, dangerous. Bruce did not raise his voice. "Short demonstration," he said. "No injuries, no humiliation. Technique only." The boundary sounded like a lock clicking shut. He chose a volunteer, plain and willing. The first exchange was clean, distance measured, timing exact, a quiet redirection that solved the problem without force. The second movement came out sharper than anyone expected, fast enough to steal air from lungs. For a heartbeat, the room forgot how to breathe. The volunteer stopped as if guided along an unseen rail. Then, so small it could be denied, Bruce's hand pressed to his side, palm flat. Not a wince, a check. Fingers tightened, released. His face stayed calm, but his weight shifted away from one rotation of the torso, guarding a line that had always been open. He smiled lightly and moved them on at once. More explaining followed. Fewer bursts. He stood closer when correcting people, so eyes couldn't linger where they wanted to look. Yet a woman near the wall, silent all evening, kept her gaze low. She noticed how he stepped around a turn he had used 1,000 times. The class ended with polite nods and the clink of keys against a metal buckle as someone hurried out. The room emptied, but suspicion did not. It lingered like liniment on the hands. And in the next hours, those who had whispered, "This is the end," would find a reason to say it out loud. The pain came back not as a flare, but as a tide. It waited until the doors were closed, until the voices faded, then rose high enough to change the way he crossed the room. Halfway to the window he stopped, breath steady, jaw loose, as if stopping were a choice, and not a necessity. He tested a slow bend, then a careful turn of the shoulders. One movement held, another did not. Someone hovered too close. "We should call someone," a voice said, quick and loud, already reaching for solutions. Another voice went quiet, eyes fixed on the floor, pretending this was none of their business. Bruce lifted a hand, not to refuse help, but to slow it. "Give me space," he said. Not sharp, final. He tried the basics he trusted most, a controlled inhale, a measured exhale. He shifted weight from foot to foot, millimeters at a time, checking which lines answered and which argued back. The body spoke clearly enough when no one interrupted it. What answered was not fear, but limits. "Well," someone offered gently, "maybe this is your sign. You've done enough." The words were dressed as care, but they closed a door all the same. Others were less careful. Overlapping murmurs, overtraining, pride, a system pushed too far. The phrases traveled faster than facts, gaining confidence as they went. Bruce thanked them. He asked again for quiet. He did not dramatize the moment, he reduced it. When he was alone, the room felt larger and colder. A clock ticked with unnecessary authority. He sat, stood, then sat again, controlling the distance each time. At the table he opened a notebook. The pen hesitated, tapped once, then began. Symptoms, triggers, what eased the pressure, what sharpened it. He wrote without decoration, stopping when the truth resisted and returning when it allowed itself to be named. He crossed out nothing. He adjusted his schedule on the page and admitted, without apology, where willpower had been doing work discipline should have done. Beyond the door, voices gathered and thinned. He didn't answer them. He looked once at his reflection, not at his face, but at the line of his stance, and nodded, almost imperceptibly. This was not surrender. It was strategy, and it split the people around him in two. Those who wanted to guard him, and those who found it easier to believe the story that said he was already finished. The worst part was not the pain. It was knowing how quickly a verdict could harden, and deciding to fight not the injury, but the certainty of others that he had lost. The first weeks after that decision stripped his days of anything explosive. The sharp turns, the sudden accelerations, everything people associated with his public strength, were cut away without ceremony. What remained looked unimpressive from the outside, standing, breathing, shifting weight so slowly it bordered on stillness. He worked close to the floor, close to the wall, close to silence. He broke movement into fragments small enough to argue with. An inhale measured to a count, he never spoke aloud. A foot placed, then replaced, until the pressure evened out. Muscles answered in chains, not flashes. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for rest, or worse, retreat. Up close, it was work that left no room for distraction. Much of it he did alone. Not out of embarrassment, but because an audience turns process into theater. When a few trusted people were present, he asked them to watch nothing except their own impatience. If emotion provoked pain, it was not challenged. It was logged. If something eased the load, it was repeated, cautiously, until it earned trust. The notebook thickened. Pages filled with short lines about sleep, stress, food, no claims, just observations. He tested ideas the way an engineer tests materials, slowly, prepared to discard what failed. Pride had no function here, only feedback. Word traveled anyway. In gyms and offices, people spoke with certainty they hadn't earned. He's done. He'll just talk now. Bruce still came around, but he conserved movement like a currency that mattered. He corrected a stance with 2 fingers. He demonstrated only what could be done without negotiation from the body. When someone pushed, "Prove you still can," he shook his head. "I won't risk it for curiosity," he said, calm enough to sound like refusal, not defense. The line disappointed those who believed respect must be purchased with spectacle. What they didn't see was the change taking shape beneath the quiet. Speed replaced by timing, strength by alignment. He was building something that did not announce itself. It demanded patience he did not enjoy, and it tested him more than pain ever had. Outside, traffic rolled past the windows, indifferent. Inside, he listened for the smallest signal before moving again, as if checking weather before setting sail. Rumors kept growing, fed by absence and misreading. And soon, someone would decide that the only way to end them was to force the question, publicly, where mistakes are loud and restraint is hardest to explain. The pressure arrived dressed as invitation. Early one evening, in a low-ceilinged room where old lamps hummed and a fan pushed tired air in circles, Bruce stepped in with the same economy he'd learned to trust. He wasn't there to answer rumors. He was there to work. The floor felt familiar under his feet. The noise did not. Some faces carried understanding. Others carried appetite. Conversations thinned when he moved past them, not out of respect, but anticipation. A man he barely knew smiled as if sharing a joke. "Just a quick check," he said lightly. No insult, no demand. The implication did the work. Bruce nodded once. "No competition," he replied. "Light contact, distance, and timing." The limits were stated plainly, as if clarity itself were a courtesy. They squared up. The first exchange stayed within the lines, hands touching and releasing, steps measured, breath quiet. Then the tempo crept upward. A shoulder drove where it hadn't been invited. Pressure arrived early, sharp enough to test a boundary rather than a skill. Bruce raised his palm and stopped it with a word. Not loud. "Enough." The sound cut cleaner than force. He didn't accuse. He didn't explain. He asked that technique not be confused with the urge to embarrass. A voice from the edge answered for him. "Careful," it said, amused. "Looks like fear." Others shifted closer, drawn by the idea that the story might break open right there. Bruce stepped aside. He faced the wall for a breath, adjusting a sleeve, aligning something inward. He made 2 small movements, feet finding angles, breath settling into a count only he used. When he turned back, the room felt narrower. "One more," he said. "Short." This time, he didn't chase. He held space. A step angled off the line, a soft contact that redirected without strain. It lasted no longer than a second, but the imbalance was unmistakable. He stopped it there, refusing the temptation to prove anything further. The room hesitated, unsure how to react to a moment that offered no spectacle. Bruce thanked his partner and moved away. No raised arms, no victory. He left with his shoulders relaxed and his future uncertain. That restraint irritated people more than any strike could have. Because the next test, he knew, would not ask politely. It would arrive as a situation designed to remove choice and demand an answer that could cost everything. The next gathering carried a different weight. Weeks had passed, maybe months, long enough for silence to harden into judgment. The room he entered this time was orderly, almost polite, and that made it worse. People here measured outcomes. Conversations stalled when he arrived, then resumed in quieter keys, as if sound itself might bias the result. Someone offered a chair. Someone else said they were glad to see him looking well. The phrase shaped like concern, but sharpened by expectation. Eventually it came, the careful request wrapped in reason. They wanted to see where he was. Nothing dramatic, just enough to understand. Bruce agreed to very little. He spoke about distance, about reading intent before movement finished forming. He asked for low stakes, and meant it. No rush, no chase. The demonstration began calmly, but bodies have their own memories. In a transition so small it barely registered, his support shifted, and a signal flared. Quick, contained, unmistakable to him. The other man felt it. He pressed harder, faster, trying to draw Bruce into a turn that would demand what the body had not offered freely. The pressure was technical, not cruel, but it was a bet. Bruce didn't retreat. He stepped aside, literally and mentally, changing the geometry so the threatened line no longer mattered. Then he did something that looked almost disappointing. He stopped. He changed level. He intercepted the path just enough to steal balance without taking it. The force went nowhere, and the moment emptied itself. Some people frowned, confused. Others went very still, recognizing what had happened because they knew how hard it was not to add anything extra. Bruce released immediately, took a step back, and let the space reset. No follow-up, no punctuation. The room filled with sounds again, glasses touching a table, a laugh that didn't land. He returned the conversation to neutral ground as if nothing of consequence had occurred. Inside, he understood the danger hadn't passed. Even success could be rewritten. An accident. A fluke. He accepted that risk. Better that than gambling his body for applause. As the meeting wound down, the silence lingered longer than the talk. In it, a decision was forming. To push once more, without courtesy. And Bruce knew that when it came, his answer would have to be brief enough to survive retelling, and clean enough to leave behind respect instead of debris. They gathered again where sound carried, and witnesses mattered. Everyone knew why. Bruce arrived early and took the edge of the floor, moving through a quiet preparation that looked almost ceremonial in its restraint. A step placed, tested, returned. Breath aligned. No sudden reaches. No bravado. He checked the ground the way one checks ice. The request came without disguise this time. One last test. The words were meant to close the argument before it began. Bruce listened, then answered with conditions so narrow they left little room for interpretation. Very short. First, clear control ends it. The other man agreed too quickly. When they met, the start was violent in its intent. Fast, driving, aimed straight through a line Bruce had been protecting for weeks. For an instant, the risk was absolute. He didn't give ground. He stepped at an angle that stole certainty, fingers touching not to strike, but to guide. The timing broke the rush. A small turn of the shoulder, a redirection so clean it felt like absence, and the attacker passed through empty space. Bruce held control for a breath, long enough for everyone to understand what could have followed. Then, let go. Silence hit hard. Fabric whispered as bodies adjusted. Someone inhaled sharply and stopped halfway. A set of keys fell and rang once against the floor. The man tried to laugh it away, offered an explanation that sounded thin even to him. Those who understood didn't respond. They had seen enough. Bruce nodded, asked quietly if he was all right, and stepped back. Only then did the signal arrive, a brief warning from his body, contained and answered without a change of face. He kept his shoulders loose, his gaze open. There was nothing to prove now. He left without ceremony, aware that the story would travel without him. It would be trimmed, argued over, reshaped. But the facts had been placed carefully where they could stand on their own. Years later, when the details surfaced, people spoke less about how fast he moved than about how he stopped. They said the strength wasn't in the contact, but in the choice. And they understood, too late to cheer, that he had been training not to defeat men, but to meet fear without surrendering himself. Years passed before the quiet work became visible to anyone else, not as footage, not as a headline, but as recollection. People who had stood along those walls began to speak less about tests and more about intervals, the long spaces between moments when nothing dramatic happened and discipline carried the weight. Some remembered the notebooks, not titles or formulas, just pages filled with restrained handwriting, pauses where a line stopped short. He tracked his body the way others track weather, patterns, warnings, small shifts that matter only if you respect them. There was no mystery in it, only patience assembled into a system. Breath before movement, foot before force, pain acknowledged, never invited. What had looked like disappearance was a reassembly. He had not slowed to fade. He had slowed to become exact. Those who once said, "It's over," learned, uncomfortably, that silence is not the same as absence. He was still there, just no longer negotiating with crowds. One man, older now, admitted the hardest thing to accept wasn't that Bruce had controlled the situation. It was how he had stopped it. No finish, no claim. He ended moments the way others end sentences, with a period, not an exclamation. In retelling, Bruce never sounded triumphant. The line that survived was simpler, that he chose to preserve himself and the person in front of him, and that this choice cost him applause, but bought him integrity. The early moment, the hand pressed briefly to his side, returned in memory with a different meaning. It wasn't weakness concealed, it was information respected. The final image stayed small. A room with no audience, breath steady, a foot checking the floor before committing weight. Strength expressed as restraint, practiced until it became habit. That was the secret, if it deserved the word. Not a technique hidden from view, but the courage to say no when noise demanded yes. What looked like an ending had been a beginning of a quieter kind. And when someone later said, "It's finished," those who remembered understood. Sometimes the truest power starts exactly there, when proof is abandoned and control remains.